Hello, and welcome to The Power of Discovery, Defining Workflow Before App Building. My name is Leanne Snowick, and I'm an implementation consultant at Quickbase. I've also been a builder for the past 14 years, working on all types of processes that particularly I am not a subject matter expert in. Some of those have been digital advertising, procurement, quote-to-cash process, server hardware deployment, and car manufacturing. So I'm here to tell you that you don't necessarily need to be a subject matter expert in the application that you're going to be building. And we're going to get through that by going through this discovery process. So just a note, for a lot of my career, my focus has been on building out ERP systems and large-scale long-term solutions using Quickbase. So during that time, I've developed this discovery method that I'm going to be showing you today. Okay, let's start with our introduction to discovery. Discovery is really considered the project planning phase of your Quickbase app building process. And so what we're really trying to do here is understanding why our users act a particular way so that we can understand how to build our application. So let's talk about the discovery phase a little bit. What we're going to be doing here is bringing together cross-functional teams so that we can discuss their process and collaborate on improvements. Now, why would we perform deep discovery in a no-code platform that's typically known for moving quickly? I think one of the key benefits of Quickbase, besides the no-code quick movement of it, is that Quickbase is a tool customized to your process. And this is different from a point solution where you need to customize your process to fit with a standard tool. So that's why we really need to dig in to make sure that our process is as perfect as possible as we design a tool around that process. Okay, so who should we be involving at this stage of the building phase? And I would say that you want to include anyone that has a stake in the data that will be used in the tool. So even if they're not daily users, if they receive a report from Quickbase, we need to understand their voice and what they need to see from the data. And those people that we involve during this part of the process are going to be our subject matter experts. They're people that live with their process or workflow on a daily basis. And so we really want their voice to be heard. And then what is your role as a builder? I hope everybody here today sees themselves as a builder or a person that's going to be performing discovery before the building process. And I'm here to tell you that you've been promoted. You're not just a builder. You're going to be wearing a lot of hats during this process and across your time building in Quickbase. And we're going to dig into that as we go through this presentation today. And finally, I just want to mention that Quickbase has many ways to create a user experience. So that's why we're talking about this why. Unless we understand how users act in a particular way, we are not going to be sure exactly how to build out the system, but we want to make their experience as useful and delightful as possible, which is why we're including them in the process. Okay, so what are the dangers of avoidance? I understand that people may tend to avoid discovery. It's not the most glamorous part of the process. So what are the reasons that people avoid discovery? Well, like we mentioned just a minute ago, solving problems immediately is something you can do with Quickbase, and people really want that to happen. A lot of times people like to avoid conflict. Getting people to decide on different things is a difficult part of the process. We always want to showcase our builder skills because Quickbase is super cool, and we like to be able to show that off and use that as quickly as possible. And it's comfortable. When we are able to enjoy the view from 10,000 feet on a process, everything looks pretty good. So now I just want to talk about some of the cons, as you could probably tell in my voice that I have identified them. When you jump into solving problems immediately, you're really going to miss some of the real problems that exist for your users that maybe they're not even aware are problems. Things like process failure points, manual workarounds, bad data, duplicative work. people tend to do this just to get through their workday. And we don't want to add those issues into our new Quickbase system. So other cons of delaying this or not doing it is to delay the conflict. Conflict at this point is unavoidable. You're going to be collaborating with different groups, and you really want to be the person that helps prioritize a healthy exchange of ideas so that that collaboration can start here. If your users are not engaged at the beginning, it's going to be really hard for them to get really excited about a new process or a new tool that they had no involvement in making. So you're really going to miss out on a key function of getting the application in user hands and have them happy about it if you don't do this in the beginning. And you're going to be centering the builder instead of the user during this process. While building a Quickbase application can be fun and exciting, we really want the user experience to be delightful, and that's what we should be thinking about. And finally, limiting the ROI that can be realized is mostly because if you avoid all of this at the beginning, you're probably going to have to go back to it later and redo some of the things that you just jumped right into. Okay, so moving on. The level and the depth and the time frame of the discovery that we're going to talk about today really will correspond to the complexity of the workflow that you're going to be developing for. So I'm going to give you a flexible tool set where you don't need to utilize every tool that we discuss during every integration process or discovery process. The scale of your discovery will expand based on multiple items. So let's look at a couple of those items. So we have these dependencies, right? The application timeline and the growth potential of your application. Is this something that's going to live just on a short time period for the next 3 months while a project is taken care of? Or is there real growth potential here? As I mentioned, I have worked on a lot of ERP systems, and they usually start with an individual project or, piece of the process that we want to develop, but we're going to be working on a much longer initiative. So the discovery has to adapt to that, and it has to be a bit greater. Another point of view that you should really take here when analyzing how much discovery is necessary is the visibility and the dependence on the data. If you have executives looking at this data on a daily basis, you really want to make sure that there's understanding across the team about how that data functions and what it means. The same thing with dependence. If you're utilizing this data to be pushed into, say, a financial tool, you want to make sure that it is very clear what that data means and does. So that means your discovery has to be a bit deeper. And finally, the state of your current modernization. If you're walking into a process that has already been defined from end to end with all the details, maybe it lives in another tool right now, and you're just transferring it over, that could mean that you need less time and maybe less investigative work in order to get the discovery done. And then finally, the number of functional groups and the number of workflows that exist within your end-to-end process are going to, again, impact the amount of time and the length of discovery that you do. And I would just want to make a note here that there are some use cases that are just tweaks to a current application. Those can actually go through discovery, right? If you need to go through the step-by-step process of these new changes, you're going to want to add that to your documentation and make sure that it fits in with the overall process. But then there are some tweaks that you don't necessarily need to go through discovery for, and maybe just an update to the process documentation will suffice. It's up to you guys to decide really the level of discovery that you're going to plan for. But my main point here is that you do want to plan for it. Okay, so let's talk about our key takeaways from this presentation today. Our goal together is to be able to create the best system possible. That's the goal for your team, and that's the goal as a leader of discovery. So what we want to do in this session is to learn about your role, how it operates, what are your objectives, particularly in this phase of the building process. The other things that we want to understand is how can we get what we need from the teams that we work with so that one, we become a trusted resource to them. And also so that number three, we can develop the artifacts and the details we need. So when we sit in front of Quickbase, we are ready to start building. And I would just say one final note here is that Quickbase, the discovery process and the building process and almost everything you do, our philosophy is iterative. So that typically means that the building process will take an incremental approach, and that's a little different than traditional software development. We are constantly asking for feedback, building and planning and testing and going back to the drawing board as we build our Quickbase application. And I would also note here that through the discovery process, we're doing the same things. We're getting our users together to go through the discovery process and documenting that, and then planning what we're going to do, and probably going through that process a couple more times. And then one final note I'd like to make here is that you do not need to wait until you have all of the discovery information completed before you start building. It is a good process to have, but at the same time, sometimes building out a prototype or designing a bit of the Quickbase application to show your users what the potential of the possible is going to be a great tool for you. And it can also help people get unstuck trying to simply recreate the current manual process that they have. Okay, so let's get into the agenda of what we're going to cover today. I've mentioned a couple times we're going to talk about being a discovery leader. We're also going to look at some artifacts and examples of documentation. And then we're going to talk about building the blueprint. How do we actually accomplish this? And finally, we'll have time for Q&A. And I would just like to say throughout this presentation, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat window. Okay, as a discovery leader, we're going to look at our role description. What are our key objectives, and how do we build trust and learn the language of the group that we're working with? So as a discovery leader, you're going to be wearing many hats, and primarily you'll be the facilitator and group leader. I would also say you're a coach. Your role is to make sure that everybody is involved and has a voice in the process and in providing information on their workflow. Secondarily, I think that you're going to become a researcher and reporter. You're really digging for information and, if you will, an archaeologist on this process, right? You're trying to understand who is involved here. What are they doing? Are they using other systems? When does data change hands? How is all of this accomplished? And finally, why? I think why is a great question to constantly ask. There are going to be times when your subject matter experts really understand the process and they don't know that maybe they're skipping over something that everybody doesn't know. And so to have that why in your pocket is a good way to have them open up about things that they find very natural that maybe are key to the process that an outsider wouldn't necessarily understand. And that makes you the reporter in the situation. You're kind of looking at their process from an outside point of view. And then finally, you are the Quickbase builder and system architect. So as you're listening and understanding and digging into this process, you're also trying to relate that back to the requirements and the scope definition of the project. And I would say of all the tools that you have in your Quickbase builder toolbox, right? So that's what you're constantly looking for because that's the end result for you personally. Okay, as a discovery leader, we have some key objectives here that we need to keep in mind as we're going through this process. The first one is that we're building consensus. We really want to get everybody on the same page with both processes, how the process runs, and the features that we'll be implementing. We also are on the mission to perfect the workflow process. So that means we need to maybe make tweaks along the way, but our goal is to finalize and get buy-in on the best process that we can for this workflow. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we have a technical job ahead of us. So we really need to start thinking about how we can create those blueprints for when we start designing in Quickbase. Okay, now we get to some soft skills here, which may not come as natural to everybody that's doing a technical role. These are trust building and language learning. And these are just a few tips to kind of get you into that mindset of being this coach and leader for your team. So the first one is to speak the language. As early and often as possible, exchange the words that you would typically use for the words that your team uses. So for example, if you're used to calling a project, but your team calls it a job, adjust your language so that you are talking the same language as them. This is going to increase trust and get everybody on the same page. It's also helpful to define the language, which we'll talk about a little bit later, so that when somebody uses a particular terminology, everybody is on board with it, means the same thing. Okay, be objective. This may be a little difficult if you have some experience in the subject matter that you are overseeing the discovery on. In meetings with multiple teams, there may be natural in any process some push and pull between groups. And there may be defensiveness with people changing their process. It's important to keep in mind that your goal is to be objective because your role in this process is to represent the system, which is a totally logical entity that really only cares about things going in a replicable order. So that's why your goal here is to be objective. And remember, you're just representing a system that is also very objective. And I would say finally, in this trust building phase, you really want to lean into your own ignorance and also rely on your subject matter experts. The people in the group to answer these questions, while you may have advice on them, are really the ones that will give you the best input as to the natural progression of their workflow. And so you want to always be asking them, how do they feel about the different changes that are being made? And it's okay to not understand something. I think when you're ready to dig into a new process, you're not going to understand everything, and you may never be able to understand everything that they're talking about, but it gives you a really good guide to lean in on places where maybe their process is not as strong as they think it is. So use that to your advantage. Okay, so now that we understand being a discovery leader, I think that we should jump into artifacts and examples. We're going to go through what a process map looks like. We are going to kind of understand the different process documents we want to have at the end of this phase. And we're going to look at what some of those documents look like. Okay, so for our exercise, very quick and easy exercise, you can see on the map here, this is a map with a starting point of my house going over to the beer garden across town to visit a friend. And the purpose of this exercise is to really understand, this is our 10,000 foot view. When a group comes to you and they say, we have a very easy process. It starts here and it ends here. That is great, but it really misses all the details that you're going to need when you start building in Quickbase. So let's kind of take a look at this. And I'd love for everybody in the chat window to just answer some of these questions and think about what's missing when we just have a very general view or a general process map. I will answer some of these questions with my examples. So what details are missing from this map? Well, what I don't see on this map is I don't know how long it's going to take me to get there. I'm not really sure who's involved, right? Is somebody coming with me? Am I going by myself? What streets do I exactly turn on? Because from this view, I can't really tell that information. And then, as in any process, as you all have probably witnessed, there are very simple things that could impact the overall path that we take to get to the endpoint. So for example, what if one of these streets are closed? Do I have alternative options on this map? What is the time of day that this event is taking place? Because personally in New York, there's always traffic. So you'd really want to change your route if there is going to be traffic on this particular direction. And then what if the person driving me canceled? So these are just some simple things that could happen that would affect my process here. And finally, what scenarios does this map not even apply? Well, if I decided to ride my bike versus taking public transportation versus taking a taxi, these are all places where I would need a totally different map. So we're going to dig into what this means when we get into the actual documents, but I wanted you guys to really see how having one piece of information that's very kind of high level is not necessarily going to get you to building fields and tables in Quickbase. Okay, so actually Google Maps really understands process discovery. They have given us not just the map, right? But usually you also get the step-by-step documentation and alternate routes. And this is really important, and this is what we want to get to at the end of our discovery process. It's a real 360-degree view of the process. It does leave out a few things, such as roles, who's going to be involved, and things like that. But as you can see here, we have our start and end point on the map. We have our step-by-step, which tells me what happens at each trigger or handoff point with street names and how long each part is going to take. And then finally, we have alternate routes, right? So if I want to add a destination and pick up something along my way, I can do that. If I decide to walk versus ride my bike. So all of that information is helping me understand my process to get across town. And as you will probably see, and if you already have, digging into a particular process, you'll notice it's never as simple as the best case scenario. And so that's what we want to kind of plan for here. Okay, so I'd like a little bit more interaction here. If you guys could write into the chat window any other types of documents that could help you start formulating the process documents that we saw on the previous slide. So for example, what we want to do in these scenarios is we want to ask for all available documents that a user group has that will help us start our learning process. So for example, if they already have a process map or a submission form that kicks off the process, those are documents that we're going to want to ask for. And sometimes groups don't even realize that there are documents that they have that could be really helpful in this scenario. So what I like to do is to build out a list of different documents that I can mention to trigger the memory of the users in the group and hopefully provide me with as much information as they can. So I'd like everybody to try to think of some documents that you can think of that would help you formulate a process. And if you could write those in the chat window, I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, and on the next slide, what I'll do here is just show you some of the documents that I find really useful that maybe you haven't thought of. I think it's also helpful for everybody to look in the chat window. There could be documents that other people think of that are helpful for you as well, and even some specific industry documents that you guys may want to write down to help build out your list that maybe only you would know about or your industry would have. Okay, so I'm not going to read through all these because we're going to go on the next slide and take a look at what these look like. But there are some key points here that I would just like to acknowledge. When we're looking at these items, we really want to see real life information, right? So we don't want a test project to be filled out on our submission form. We also want, if they have any of these documents that they've updated with suggested changes, that's a great place to start, and we definitely will welcome that. We always want to have more than one document. And then we would prefer examples of perfectly executed documents versus poorly executed. Everybody knows that when you get submissions or you're looking at project trackers, there's some people that fill it out exactly as intended and other people that have filled it out with missing data and maybe incorrectly. Those are going to help us formulate real world examples to build our tool in so that we're not just performing for the best case scenario. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of these documents. The first one we have is onboarding materials. I think that people kind of forget about onboarding materials sometimes because it's really outside of the department or specific process information. But as you can see here on this new employee orientation guide, there's a lot of information that is backup to this sheet that would be really helpful for us to start learning about this department and the process. So don't be scared to ask for that. We obviously want it related to the department and not just the overall company. Process step-by-step outline. So it may not be as perfect as the one we saw on Google, but you can see here that this gives us kind of an idea of the step-by-step that this department is going to take. It also shows us other tools that they use. So this is really great information gathering. Okay, process map. So here you can see, oh, we're getting an even bigger picture, right? We have some user roles. We have what happens when each thing is passed from one group to the next. So this is another helpful document. Along with intake and submission forms. So these are great. They can happen at the beginning of a process or at the middle. Anytime people are asking for information from another group or even internally, these intake or submission forms are really helpful. And they also are going to be the basis of our forms in Quickbase. So it's really good to have examples of this and how they're filled out. Okay, Excel data trackers. Maybe you're taking projects from Excel and moving them into Quickbase. This is going to help you identify that information. And finally, what does the data look like in its exported state or in its final state? We really want to see this. Having all of the reports that need to come out of the data in your Quickbase is going to help you build properly for that export. Okay, let's move on. Now that we've looked at some of the documents, we understand our role, let's go into how we're actually going to accomplish this. This is more the technical aspects of leading discovery, and that's going to include our action plan, how our role in that action, and then what are we going to be left with in order to move into the next phase of planning our Quickbase application. Okay, so our action plan here, there are 4 parts to this process that we're going to walk through on the other slides. And this is really the how of your discovery process. The first one is just document review, which we just went over some of the documents. The next one is story time. And that's really just a conversation with the users about their process. The next one is the document deep dive, which is really digging into those documents with your user group. And finally, the wrap up and the executive team approval. And I will just mention again that this is an iterative process. You may go, step 1, step 2, and then go right back up to step 1 again when you find new documents. But it is iterative and you will be building on everything that you learn, even if you go up and down the ladder a couple times. Okay, so let's get into it. Document review. This is quiet time, right? This is for you, the discovery leader, to start reviewing all the documents and get up to speed with the department and the processes that they have. So what are you looking for when you're looking at all these documents? You're looking at terminology. Is it consistent? Is it consistent across documents? This is, again, going to help us start using those terms and words in our upcoming discussions. We're looking for roles and users. Are there any groups that have not been involved in, our planning thus far? Do we need to make sure that they're represented in our story time coming up? Inconsistencies. So we're looking for inconsistencies in the process, in the terminology, and in the data. So make notes anytime you see that so that you can bring it up during the next part of this process. The next part that we're looking into is potential improvements. So if you have some ideas, it's great to write it out when you see it in the documents. And you're also going to want to look for things like data normalization. Maybe they used a blank text field instead of a drop down, and you can see that that could be an improvement. And any automation potential. So these are things that are going to increase your capital with the group when you meet with them, because You're asking them to take their time to explain their process to you, an outsider, and you want to be able to offer stuff back. So by preparing this information, you are coming to the table knowledgeable about what their processes are, and then also bringing to them potential improvements that you saw just by reviewing their documents. So it's really going to help you during the next stage. And the output of this is that you're going to have marked up documents with notes that you can refer to during the next phase and ongoing. This is really going to help you kind of refer back to things as you talk through them. Okay, so the next part, as I mentioned, I call it story time. What it really is the end-to-end process in a discussion with the participants or the user group that you're working with. I would suggest that you ask them to not rely on documents during this process. You really want it to be a discussion and a story, if you will. So the leader actions here are, again, you're going to gather the correct representatives. Anybody that you are sure is going to be working on this project or involved with the data, you're going to be including here. It's up to you really how many people you have. Obviously, smaller working groups are better here. So if you could have maybe one representative from a group, that would be helpful. Your role in this meeting or meetings, which it probably will be more than one, is to lead, listen, and document. So you are really leading the group, and you're going to be there for when things get off of track. You are going to maintain order, and you're going to administrate between the different groups that maybe have differing point of views. You're also going to be listening, and you want to write everything down. This is going to get you to your step-by-step process document, right? So what are you listening for? Well, one, you want to maintain a linear order. So anytime somebody gets off of that linear order, your job is to pull them back in. You're also listening for where do they think the story starts and ends? That's not always the same as what you've been told coming into this meeting. You're going to want to listen to the language that they use. You're going to want to listen for conflict. As we said before, there's going to be a push and pull naturally in a process. Somebody needs something the other person needs to provide. And you want to listen for places where they don't agree on how the process flows, or they don't agree that information's always filled out adequately. You're also listening for who is doing these different things, right? What are the roles? Who are the people? And ensuring that they're included. Okay, finally, you're going to be doing questioning everything. So again, just your role is to ask why as many times as you need to. You want to understand who's doing what. Are fields ever filled in incorrectly? You want to, as you're asking these questions, your real goal is to build and force consensus. So asking people, what do you think is the hardest part of this process? What is your idea of a way that it could be easier or better, or that you would love to see it go if you could do anything to this process? And your subject matter experts will have answers for you. They've thought about this. They want it to be better. So listen to them. And finally, as I mentioned, you want to document everything, because we're coming out of this meeting with a step-by-step process document, right? Our linear order. We want to be able to have identified alternate and forking processes. So these are ones that maybe require a separate process document to be created or need to be come back to in a separate meeting. This could also be different types of the same workflow. So for example, sometimes you'll have a project, but project type A has to go through a different set of approvals than project type B. That's what you're looking for here. You really want to understand what are the different paths that your workflow takes. You're also going to be formulating in your head is clarified roles, handoff points, and your terminology. So this is some of the Quickbase stuff that you're going to need to put into practice at the end. So start thinking about, instead of talking in terms of people doing things, you want to start talking about roles doing things. Okay, the next part of our discovery agenda is the document deep dive. So at this point, you really have dug into the documents yourself. You've talked with everybody to understand their linear process. And now you want to bring out these documents and really dig into the details. Again, we're going to gather the representatives and we're going to bring the documents together that we have that they provided for us. And we're going to identify the start, middle, and end documents. What kicks off the process? What are the tracking or the project management tools that are used in the middle? And then what happens at the end of the process, all the reports that are needed. During this process, again, you're looking for any new words, phrases, roles, people that come up, because you're going to need to go back through the process and integrate those into your step-by-step. Perhaps ask for new documents to look over, and really just iterate on this process, because even if you've done a fantastic job up until this point, there's always going to be something new that comes out as you discuss more and more the process. And the most important point of this part of the process is to walk through each document field by field. And I understand that sounds very tedious, and it is a bit tedious, but what you're looking for here is you're getting data inconsistencies at really the most basic level. You're looking for places you can normalize and really offer benefits for your users, right? So multiple choice lists, status fields that are going to move things to the next part of the process. Anything that should be required from one step to the next is also what you're looking for here. And our outputs from this are really going to give us the tools to build our Quickbase system. We're going to understand our documents, which are going to be forms and reports that we have in Quickbase, and even dashboards. We're going to understand what our outputs look like so that we can build proper reporting and build our architecture in a way that supports that. And we're also going to be looking at all the little details here, right? Fields, rules, permissions, different views, and action items. They're all things that we're going to walk away from this part of the discovery process with. Okay, and finally, throughout this process, you've probably identified different things that have changed during the process, updates to documents, and you want to go through one last review. You know, when everybody's in a group together, things may sound great, and then when they see it on paper, there may be more tweaks to be made. So we really want to go through circulating our documents, ensuring that we're all on the same page and we heard the same things in the meetings, and then specifically call out any significant process changes, just so that managers are aware and that anybody that's also works on this process tangentially is also okay with the changes that you guys are making internally. And so from that, you should have team buy-in and approval and executive approval. Now, all of this that we've just done is so that we could have these very specific discovery outputs. The first one, it's a very soft target, right? But it's trust. Because you consulted and worked diligently with your users and you didn't shy away from the tough questions, they now trust that you have their best interests in mind, and they trust that you're building a tool for them. The second output from this is that you're going to have discovery documents, and that's really helpful for you. It's also really helpful for the users when they start using the system and they're using it in the new process that you guys have developed together. So that may not come immediately naturally to them. So we want to make sure that we have that documentation so that they can follow it in the new tool. And finally, you're going to gain a lot of scope clarity here. You're going to understand the real start and end of the process, and then you're going to be able to decide on phased approaches. So perhaps there's a workflow that will come secondarily based on the way that the workflow lays out. Okay, so let's go over some specifics of the lessons that you've learned and how that can translate into your Quickbase process. So you should start to understand now your process start and end points. You're going to understand the roles and action items of those role users, the trigger and handoff points that happen throughout the process, the rules and requirements that govern the data and the people that are involved, your data and formula fields, shared and private information, and any workflow divergence points, like we were saying, project A versus project B. What are the changes there, and what are the requirements for those different types of the workflow? And finally, your outputs and reporting. And we take all these lessons learned and the documents that we have, and now we can start translating those into our Quickbase build pieces. And you'll see some of them translate pretty easily, but overall, our system architecture and integrations is the thing that we're going to really want to develop overall based on the information that we have. Our roles, permissions, and dashboards, our fields, forms, reports, permissions, and rules. And then finally, the automated actions, right? So once we have a lot of this built out, what can we take away from users to make their life easier in terms of automating our tool? And I would just like to mention that as we're in this planning phase, if you will, for the build, this is kind of the first step, is really understanding all the pieces that go into it. And after that, you can start building out your architecture for the application. So for us, usually the next step is the relationship diagram and the table structures. And I would just like, again, to mention the other Empower session that will tackle this part of the planning phase. And that's by Nashmia Burney. And she's going to show you 0 to 60 app planning to implementation. And she will really show you how she built out relationship diagrams and table structures utilizing discovery information right in Lucidcharts and then using the visual builder in Quickbase. So finally, I would just like to reiterate our key takeaways from this presentation. I hope that you all have learned about the role and the objectives in this phase of the process, and that you feel confident going into it, that you know what you need to get out of your teams and out of this part of the process, and that you are clear on the artifacts that would be very helpful for you when building your Quickbase application. Okay, so before we get to the Q&A, I just wanted to thank everybody for your time and ask that you share any feedback and also rate the session. And if you do have questions that come at a later time, my name's Leanne Snowick, and you can always head over to the Quickbase community Slack, and you can @me and I will answer any additional questions that you have.